When I first witnessed Americans gathered in their town halls and churches in the 1830s, I observed something both magnificent and troubling, a democracy so passionate about equality that it would eventually turn that passion against itself. What struck me then was not just America's capacity for self-governance, but the seeds of future discord I could already detect beneath the surface of this remarkable experiment. The very forces that made American democracy exceptional, its commitment to equality, its celebration of individual opinion, its trust in majority rule, contained within them the potential for the cultural divisions you witness today. The culture wars that seem so modern, so unprecedented, were actually predictable consequences of democratic equality itself. I saw how Americans, in their zealous pursuit of equality, would inevitably fragment into competing groups, each claiming moral authority, each demanding that society conform to their vision of justice. What I couldn't have anticipated was how technology would amplify these tendencies, turning every citizen into both judge and jury in the court of public opinion. But understanding the roots of cultural conflict isn't cause for despair, it's the key to managing democracy's greatest challenge: how to maintain unity while preserving the very diversity and freedom that makes democratic life worth living. Chapter 1: The Democratic Revolution That Changed Everything. In 1831, I came to America to study its prisons, but I discovered something far more profound: a complete transformation of human society that would reshape the world. The democratic revolution I witnessed wasn't merely political, it was civilizational, altering how people think, feel, and relate to one another in ways that would inevitably lead to the cultural battles you see today. For centuries, aristocratic societies had maintained order through hierarchy and tradition. People knew their place, accepted their station, and rarely questioned the fundamental assumptions of their world. Social roles were fixed, cultural norms were stable, and change occurred gradually across generations. But democracy shattered these ancient arrangements, replacing them with something unprecedented: a society where every individual claimed equal moral authority. This transformation liberated human potential in extraordinary ways. I marveled at Americans' energy, innovation, and optimism. But it also unleashed forces that aristocratic societies had successfully contained. When everyone becomes equal in principle, every opinion demands equal consideration, every lifestyle claims equal validity, and every group insists on equal recognition, the very foundations of cultural authority begin to crumble. What I observed in those early decades was democracy's tendency to fragment inherited cultural consensus. Americans constantly questioned traditional arrangements, religious practices, family structures, educational methods, social customs. This questioning spirit drove remarkable progress, but it also created permanent instability. Without shared authorities to resolve disputes, cultural conflicts would multiply and intensify. The democratic passion for equality couldn't be satisfied merely through political reforms. It demanded social, cultural, and moral equality as well. I watched Americans apply democratic principles to every aspect of life: marriage, child rearing, religious worship, artistic expression. Each application created new areas of potential conflict as different groups developed competing interpretations of what equality demanded. American democracy's greatest strength, its capacity to empower ordinary citizens, became a source of endless cultural tension. When everyone possesses equal political rights, cultural disagreements transform into battles over public policy. Questions about marriage, education, morality, and lifestyle stop being private matters and become political ones, subject to majority rule and democratic debate. I realized that America's cultural wars weren't aberrations or temporary conflicts, they were inherent features of democratic equality itself. A society committed to the principle that all individuals are created equal must perpetually struggle with the practical implications of that commitment. Chapter 2: when majority opinion becomes cultural tyranny. What troubled me most during my American journey wasn't the possibility of political tyranny. Americans had created remarkable constitutional safeguards against that danger. What concerned me was something more subtle and potentially more dangerous: the tyranny of prevailing opinion over cultural and moral questions. In aristocratic societies, individuals might suffer under political oppression, but they retained inner freedom because social authority was divided among many institutions: church, nobility, local customs, professional guilds. No single force controlled all aspects of life. But in democratic America, I witnessed the emergence of something new: majority opinion that claimed authority over every sphere of human existence. Americans, I observed, possessed an almost religious faith in public opinion. They believed that whatever the majority believed must be true, whatever was popular must be right. This democratic faith served them well in political matters, but when applied to cultural questions, it created an invisible but powerful form of social tyranny. I watched how this worked in practice. When dominant opinions solidified around particular moral or cultural positions, dissenting voices didn't need to be legally silenced, they were socially marginalized. Individuals who held unpopular views found themselves isolated, their ideas dismissed without consideration, their perspectives excluded from polite society. The tyranny was voluntary but nearly total. This phenomenon would intensify as American democracy matured. The same forces that made political participation more equal would make cultural conformity more demanding. Social media and mass communication would eventually allow majority opinion to form more quickly and exercise pressure more comprehensively than I could have imagined. The tragedy is that democracy needs cultural diversity to remain healthy. Different communities must be free to experiment with different ways of life, different moral frameworks, different approaches to human flourishing. But the democratic passion for equality creates pressure toward cultural uniformity that stifles this essential diversity. I predicted that Americans would face recurring cycles where emerging cultural movements would challenge established norms, provoke massive social resistance, and eventually either triumph completely or be defeated utterly. The middle ground, the space for reasonable disagreement and cultural pluralism, would perpetually shrink under the pressure of democratic opinion. The culture wars you experience today follow this pattern precisely. Each side seeks not merely tolerance for their views, but cultural dominance. Each believes that democratic equality requires society to embrace their particular vision of justice, morality, and human flourishing. Neither can accept the legitimacy of fundamental disagreement because democracy has taught them that majority rule should determine truth itself. Chapter 3: The Associative Spirit That Could Heal Division. Yet during my travels, I discovered something that offered hope against democracy's divisive tendencies: the remarkable American genius for association. Nowhere else had I seen ordinary citizens so naturally form voluntary organizations to address shared concerns, pursue common interests, and solve collective problems. This associative spirit represented democracy's greatest defense against cultural tyranny. When individuals join freely chosen communities, religious congregations, professional societies, charitable organizations, educational institutions, they create alternative sources of authority and belonging that resist the homogenizing pressure of mass opinion. In New England towns, I observed how voluntary associations taught Americans essential democratic skills: listening to opposing views, finding common ground, accepting majority decisions while protecting minority rights, and working together despite fundamental disagreements. These intermediate institutions stood between the isolated individual and the overwhelming power of majority opinion. Consider how this applies to contemporary cultural conflicts. When Americans participate actively in diverse associations, churches that welcome theological debate, professional organizations that include different political perspectives, charitable groups that unite people across ideological lines. They develop relationships that transcend cultural divisions. I learned that successful associations require members to practice what I called self-interest rightly understood. Participants must subordinate their immediate preferences to long-term collective benefits. A church member might disagree with particular teachings but remain committed to the community. A professional might dislike colleagues' political views but work together effectively toward shared goals. This principle offers a model for managing cultural conflict democratically. Instead of demanding that all of society conform to particular cultural values, different groups could focus on building strong internal communities while cooperating with others on shared concerns. Religious conservatives and secular progressives might disagree about marriage and family but collaborate on addressing poverty or environmental challenges. The decline of associative life that many observers note today helps explain why cultural conflicts have become so intense and bitter. When Americans belong primarily to like-minded groups, ideologically homogeneous churches, politically uniform neighborhoods, professionally segregated social networks, they lose opportunities to practice democratic engagement across difference. Revitalizing America's associative culture won't eliminate cultural disagreements, but it could transform how those disagreements are conducted. Strong associations teach their members to distinguish between core principles worth fighting for and peripheral issues where compromise is possible. They create bonds of trust and mutual respect that can survive political and cultural disagreements. The path forward requires intentionally building associations that bring together Americans from different cultural backgrounds around shared practical concerns. This doesn't mean avoiding difficult conversations about fundamental values. It means having those conversations within relationships strong enough to survive disagreement. Chapter 4: How Democratic Individualism Fragments Community. As I observed American social life more deeply, I identified another force that would inevitably contribute to cultural conflict: the peculiar form of individualism that democracy generates. Unlike the independence that aristocratic societies occasionally produced, democratic individualism was simultaneously more universal and more isolating. Democracy teaches every citizen that their individual judgment is as valid as anyone else's, that they need not defer to traditional authorities, that they can and should think for themselves about fundamental questions. This democratic individualism unleashed remarkable creativity and innovation, but it also dissolved the social bonds that had historically held communities together through times of disagreement. I watched Americans gradually withdraw from broader community concerns into what I called the small society of family and friends. Why invest energy in difficult conversations with neighbors who hold different views when you can focus on the immediate circle of people who share your perspectives? Why engage with complex community problems when you can pursue private happiness and material success? This individualistic withdrawal created a paradox that would intensify over time. As Americans became more politically equal, they became more socially fragmented. Democracy's promise of individual freedom led not to rich community life but to what I termed individualism, a social atomization that left people vulnerable to cultural manipulation and political extremism. Consider how this dynamic plays out in contemporary culture wars. Americans increasingly sort themselves into like-minded communities, politically homogeneous neighborhoods, ideologically uniform social networks, culturally segregated institutions. This sorting allows individuals to avoid the hard work of democratic engagement across difference, but it also amplifies cultural divisions. When Americans lose regular contact with people who hold different cultural values, they begin to view those differences as threats rather than opportunities for learning. The evangelical Christian who never meaningfully interacts with secular humanists finds it easy to demonize secularism. The progressive activist who avoids contact with traditional conservatives can dismiss conservatism without understanding its legitimate concerns. Democratic individualism also encourages what I observed as Americans' tendency to judge public questions by their immediate personal impact rather than their broader social consequences. Cultural issues become personal identity markers rather than subjects for thoughtful deliberation. Support for particular policies becomes a way of expressing who you are rather than careful consideration of what might best serve the common good. The remedy isn't to suppress individual freedom. That would destroy democracy's essential character. Instead, Americans must learn to exercise their individualism within community contexts that encourage engagement across difference. This requires what I called habits of the heart, cultural practices that connect individual fulfillment with community responsibility. Democratic individualism becomes dangerous only when it's disconnected from associative life that teaches citizens to see beyond their immediate interests and perspectives. The challenge is creating communities that honor individual dignity while fostering the shared commitments necessary for democratic life. Chapter 5: Religion, Morality, and the Battle for America's Soul. Nothing struck me more forcefully during my American sojourn than the paradoxical relationship between religion and democracy. In France, I had witnessed religion and freedom as natural enemies, the church defending aristocratic privilege, democratic movements attacking religious authority. But in America, I discovered something unprecedented: religion serving as democracy's essential foundation. American religious communities taught citizens the moral habits necessary for democratic self-governance, self-restraint, concern for others, commitment to truth, respect for legitimate authority. Without these habits, I realized, democratic freedom would degenerate into license, democratic equality would become envious materialism, and democratic politics would dissolve into factional warfare. Yet I also predicted that this harmonious relationship between religion and democracy would eventually face severe strain. As democratic equality advanced, it would challenge traditional religious teachings about authority, morality, and human nature. Religious communities would face pressure to democratize their own internal structures and conform their teachings to popular opinion. This tension helps explain the cultural conflicts that divide contemporary America. Traditional religious communities find themselves defending not just particular moral teachings but the very principle that moral truth exists independently of popular approval. Secular Americans, meanwhile, view religious moral claims as threats to democratic equality and individual freedom. The stakes of this conflict extend far beyond particular policy disputes. Religion has historically provided what I called fixed points in democratic societies, shared moral foundations that transcend political disagreement and create common ground for civic engagement. When religious authority collapses or becomes purely sectarian, democratic societies lose crucial resources for managing cultural diversity and maintaining social cohesion. I observed that Americans' practical approach to religious pluralism offered a model for managing this challenge. Different religious communities maintained their distinctive teachings while cooperating on shared civic concerns. Catholics, Protestants, and Jews disagreed about theology but worked together on education, charity, and social reform. This model suggests that contemporary culture wars over religion aren't inevitable. Religious and secular Americans could maintain their fundamental disagreements about ultimate questions while finding common ground on practical issues. But this requires both sides to accept what I called the legitimate limits of democratic authority. Religious communities must acknowledge that democratic societies cannot and should not enforce purely sectarian moral requirements. They can advocate for their moral views, participate in democratic debate, and build institutions that embody their values, but they cannot use political power to compel universal compliance with religious teachings. Similarly, secular Americans must recognize that democracy needs moral foundations it cannot itself provide. They may disagree with particular religious teachings, but they should appreciate religion's role in fostering the civic virtues that make democratic life possible. The alternative to this mutual accommodation is ongoing cultural warfare that weakens both religious freedom and democratic institutions. Chapter 6: The Eternal Tension Between Freedom and Equality. At the heart of every culture war I witnessed in embryonic form lies democracy's fundamental tension, the relationship between freedom and equality. Americans were committed to both values with an intensity one had never encountered, but they struggled to understand how these commitments sometimes conflicted with each other. Democratic equality demands that all citizens enjoy equal political rights, equal opportunities for advancement, and equal dignity as human beings. But democratic freedom requires space for different choices, different lifestyles, and different values, which inevitably produces unequal outcomes and creates social differences that challenge egalitarian assumptions. I observed this tension playing out in countless ways. Americans celebrated individual liberty but worried when some individuals used their freedom to accumulate vastly more wealth than others. They praised religious freedom but questioned whether religious communities should be free to maintain practices that conflicted with democratic equality. They supported free speech but struggled with expressions that challenged prevailing moral consensus. These conflicts would intensify as American democracy matured. Each generation would face new questions about how to balance freedom and equality, and each would discover that satisfying one value sometimes required limiting the other. The culture wars you experience today are essentially debates about where these limits should be drawn. Consider contemporary conflicts over religious liberty and anti-discrimination law. Religious communities claim freedom to maintain their traditional teachings about marriage, sexuality, and gender roles. But equality advocates argue that these religious practices perpetuate unjust discrimination and should be legally restricted. Both sides invoke fundamental democratic values, but they reach opposite conclusions about how those values should be applied. Or examine debates over free speech and hate speech. Free speech advocates argue that democracy requires maximum intellectual freedom, even when that freedom is used to express offensive ideas. But equality advocates contend that some forms of speech are so harmful to marginalized groups that they undermine those groups' equal participation in democratic life. I predicted that Americans would never permanently resolve these tensions because both freedom and equality are essential to democratic life. Democracy cannot survive without robust protection for individual liberty, but it also cannot survive without meaningful commitment to human equality. The challenge is managing the inevitable conflicts between these values in ways that preserve both. This requires what I called the art of democratic statesmanship, the ability to find practical compromises that honor competing values without betraying either completely. It also requires citizens who understand that democracy is not a perfect system but a perpetual experiment in balancing competing goods. Americans must learn to see culture wars not as battles to be won but as ongoing democratic conversations about how to live together despite fundamental disagreements about ultimate values. Chapter 7: Technology, Mass Opinion, and the Future of Democratic Culture. Though I could never have imagined the technological revolution that would transform American society, the patterns I observed in the 1830s help explain how modern communications technology has intensified cultural conflict rather than resolved it. The democratic tendencies I identified, the power of majority opinion, the fragmentation of traditional authority, the pressure toward conformity, have been amplified by innovations I could never have anticipated. The mass media and social networks that dominate contemporary American life operate according to the same democratic principles I observed in town meetings and voluntary associations. Everyone's opinion counts equally, popular ideas spread rapidly, and traditional gatekeepers lose their authority to control information and shape public discourse. But these technologies also intensify democracy's most dangerous tendencies. The tyranny of majority opinion that I feared now operates with unprecedented speed and reach. Social media platforms create the illusion of democratic participation while actually concentrating enormous power in the hands of algorithmic systems designed to maximize engagement through emotional manipulation. I observed that Americans' passion for equality made them peculiarly susceptible to fashionable opinions and social pressures. Modern technology has weaponized this susceptibility, creating feedback loops that can rapidly transform minority viewpoints into seemingly overwhelming social movements, then just as quickly reverse course when attention shifts elsewhere. The individualism that I saw gradually isolating Americans from their communities has been paradoxically intensified by technologies that promise greater connection. Social media allows people to maintain the illusion of community engagement while actually avoiding the difficult work of democratic deliberation across difference. Yet technology also creates new opportunities for the associative life that I identified as democracy's greatest strength. Online communities can bring together people with shared interests across geographic boundaries. Digital platforms can facilitate civic engagement and democratic participation in ways that would have amazed me. The key question is whether Americans will use these technological tools to strengthen democratic culture or allow them to accelerate democratic decay. This choice cannot be made by technology companies or political leaders. It requires millions of individual citizens deciding how to engage with digital media in ways that support rather than undermine democratic values. I would counsel contemporary Americans to approach technology with the same spirit I observed in their most successful voluntary associations. Use digital tools to build relationships that can survive disagreement, seek out perspectives that challenge your assumptions, and resist the temptation to retreat into echo chambers that confirm your existing beliefs. Technology will continue transforming American culture in ways no one can predict, but the fundamental challenge remains the same: how to maintain unity and mutual respect in a society committed to both freedom and equality. The answer lies not in the technology itself but in the democratic habits and institutions that Americans choose to build with these powerful new tools. Conclusion. Standing in your time and looking back across nearly 2 centuries, I see that the culture wars dividing contemporary America were not accidents or aberrations. They were predictable consequences of the democratic revolution I witnessed taking root in the 1830s. The same forces that made American democracy the wonder of the world also contained the seeds of the cultural conflicts you now experience. But understanding the roots of cultural division points toward possibilities for democratic renewal. The associative spirit, the balance between freedom and equality, the role of religion in fostering civic virtue, the importance of local engagement, these insights remain as relevant today as they were when I first observed them in action. America's culture wars will not be resolved through the triumph of any single faction or ideology. They are inherent features of democratic life that must be continuously managed through the patient work of democratic citizenship. This requires Americans to recover the arts of democratic engagement, listening across difference, finding common ground while maintaining principle, and building institutions that honor both unity and diversity. The choice before you is not whether to have cultural conflicts. In a free and equal society, such conflicts are inevitable. The choice is whether to conduct these conflicts in ways that strengthen or weaken democratic institutions and democratic culture. Your democracy's future depends not on eliminating the tensions I observed but on learning to live creatively and peacefully with them. This is the eternal work of democratic citizenship, and it begins with each individual's decision to engage across difference with both courage and humility.